Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was a monument to order. It sprawled beneath a vast, domed ceiling of reinforced crystal, where distant stars burned cold and silent beyond the transparent arch. The architecture of the chamber was designed to impress, to intimidate. Floating thrones arranged in a precise spiral, hovering weightlessly in the artificial gravity, each assigned according to rank and influence. There was no randomness here, no disorder. Every movement, every word, every pause was calculated. The council thrived on control, on the illusion of unity and predictability. No species among them spoke out of turn. No voice ever rose above the carefully measured cadence of diplomacy. Here, chaos did not belong. Then, humanity arrived. They had been invited, of course. Every species inducted into the Galactic Council was granted an introduction, a ceremony of acknowledgement, assessment, and ultimately classification. It was a formality. Most newcomers were assigned minor roles, given trade rights, permitted limited expansion, and expected to follow the order of things. Humanity was no different. At least, that was the assumption. The chamber dimmed as the ceremony commenced, the air humming with the presence of the council's most esteemed members. The High Speaker, a being of elegant silver limbs and luminous skin, presided over the gathering. Their voice resonated across the vast chamber, not through sound, but through carefully attuned frequencies that reached the minds of all present. Their words were smooth, refined, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. The delegation of Earth stepped forward. The humans entered with the quiet poise of a species that had learned the weight of first impressions. There were 5 of them, all clad in the same deep black uniforms, unadorned except for a silver insignia pinned to their chests. At the forefront walked their ambassador, Elias Voss, a tall figure by human standards, his features sharp yet composed, his posture that of a man accustomed to scrutiny. He did not glance around in awe like so many species before them had. He did not hesitate. He simply walked forward, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The council observed. Humanity had been studied long before this moment. Their homeworld, Earth, was deemed unremarkable. A temperate sphere with an unstable climate, overpopulated and resource-starved, orbiting an average star. Their technological development was respectable but uninspired, their advancement marred by internal strife. Their history, a study in contradiction. Ambition tempered by self-destruction. Great civilizations had risen and crumbled in rapid succession, their species constantly teetering between brilliance and annihilation. The Council had seen this pattern before. It was the mark of a species that burned too hot, too fast. The ones that did not last. Given the right incentives, humanity would be easy to guide, easy to integrate, easy to pacify. Voss came to a stop before the speaker, standing at the designated position of deference. He did not bow. That was the first mistake the council made. They assumed he would. The speaker's luminous eyes regarded him for a moment before continuing. Humanity of Earth, you are now part of the Great Assembly. Your kind shall benefit from our unity, as countless species before you have. In return, you will abide by the laws that bind us together. We recognize your desire for peace and progress. A formal welcome, a carefully worded invitation. Voss inclined his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and controlled, but there was something in it, something the council could not immediately place. A precision that felt like a weapon, not an offering. We are honored to be here. The words were correct. The delivery was not. The council noted it but dismissed it. Many species struggled with the nuances of galactic diplomacy in their first interactions. It was expected. The ceremony preceded a procession of acknowledgments, affirmations, agreements. The humans listened. They spoke only when necessary. They asked few questions. If the council had been paying closer attention, they might have noticed the silence between the words, the way the humans watched, the way they measured the room as though it were not a place of diplomacy, but a battlefield. But the council was too accustomed to control. They mistook patience for submission. It was not until the final decree was given that a sliver of unease crept into the chamber. The speaker raised a delicate, elongated hand, signaling the formal recognition of Earth's membership. Let it be known, they intoned, that the humans are welcome among us, and that they shall contribute to the peace and prosperity of the galaxy. The words echoed in the vast chamber. There was no applause. That was not the way of the council. Instead, a resonance of approval rippled through the air, a frequency of acknowledgement. The decree was recorded. Voss nodded. His delegation inclined their heads in unison. And then, with the same quiet poise with which they had entered, they turned and walked away. The council believed the matter settled. Humanity had joined them. As expected, they had agreed to peace, to unity, to order. None of them considered what would happen when war came. None of them thought to ask what peace meant to a species that had spent its entire existence fighting to survive. The Galactic Council did not yet know how to fear humanity, but they would soon learn. Elias Voss walked through the luminous corridors of the Council's diplomatic wing, his footsteps soundless against the seamless floors. The air was crisp, infused with the sterile scent of recycled oxygen, and the walls pulsed faintly with the energy coursing through the vast structure. Every detail was immaculate, controlled, a reflection of the council itself. Yet for all its refinement, the place felt hollow. Voss had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, standing within the beating heart of the galaxy's greatest power, he saw its fragility. Behind him, his delegation moved with quiet purpose. Captain Adrian Hale, his military attaché, matched his pace, her gaze flickering over the alien architecture with the sharp calculation of someone accustomed to sizing up a battlefield. Dr. Alan Sato, their chief strategist, walked a half step behind, his silence betraying the gears turning in his mind. The two aides trailing them were unnecessary in any real capacity, an inclusion for protocol, not practicality. None of them spoke until the chamber doors sealed behind them, the seamless material hissing as it locked out the prying eyes of the council. Only then did Hale exhale sharply, the breath more telling than any words. "They think we're harmless," she muttered, the disbelief threading her voice impossible to miss. Voss allowed himself the faintest smile, one that barely touched his eyes. "No," he corrected, his voice even. "They think we're manageable. There's a difference." Sato's brow furrowed. "They've studied our history. They know about our wars, our empires, our collapses. And still, they believe we can be pacified. They don't see history the way we do." Voss turned, stepping toward the room's central display. With a flick of his hand, the interface awakened, and a three-dimensional map of the Council's territories unfurled before them. A delicate web of interwoven civilizations, their borders marked in soft pulses of light. The projection was breathtaking in its complexity. To an untrained eye, it might seem unshakable. But Voss had learned long ago that systems of control were only as strong as their weakest link. "They assume conflict is a disease," he continued, his gaze tracing the glowing pathways of power, something that can be eradicated through stability, governance, diplomacy. But war is nature. It is the engine of evolution. Hale tilted her head, arms crossed. "And they think we're unevolved." Voss tapped a command into the interface, the projection shifting to highlight the Council's primary trade routes, arteries that kept the great machine running. "They see what they want to see. A species too divided to be a threat. A people who burn themselves over and over, never learning. They mistake our chaos for weakness. They mistake our adaptability for instability," Hale murmured, shaking her head. Sato's gaze sharpened. "Which means they have no idea what's coming." It was true. The Council's arrogance had shielded them from recognizing the obvious. They believed in their hierarchy, in the inevitability of their order. To them, humanity was just another species to be assimilated, another thread woven into their grand tapestry. It had not occurred to them that humans did not submit. Not for long. The Council's military forces still existed, but Voss had already seen through the illusion. They were relics, symbols of deterrence rather than true instruments of war. The true power lay in their ability to absorb and pacify new species before they could ever pose a challenge. Their strength was not in force, but in bureaucracy. Their wars had ended because they had learned to end them before they began. It was a brilliant strategy, effective against species that feared war more than they valued independence. But humanity had never feared war. Humanity had been forged by it. Hale leaned in, studying the map. What did you notice? Sato exhaled. They're nervous. Voss nodded. They should be. They had come in peace. That much was true. But peace was a negotiation, not a surrender. And if the Council was not prepared to understand that, if they did not recognize what humanity was, what humanity had always been, then the lesson would be a painful one. Look at their supply chains. Voss gestured to the golden pathways snaking across the map, pulsing in steady rhythm. Their economy is centralized. Their food, their resources, even their fuel, it all depends on uninterrupted trade. Disrupt one of these routes, and entire sectors will feel it. Hale narrowed her eyes. Vulnerabilities. Sato crossed his arms. You think we'll need them? Voss smiled. I think it's always best to know where the cracks are before they begin to spread. It was not yet time for confrontation. That would come later, only if the Council refused to listen. For now, humanity had one advantage the Council had not accounted for. They had time. Time to watch, to learn, to become indispensable before they became a threat. The Council had opened the door, welcoming humanity into the fold, believing they had tamed the newest addition to their empire. But Voss knew better. Empires did not tame humanity. Empires crumbled before them. Hale exhaled through her nose, glancing at Sato. So what's our first move? Voss's gaze flickered to a sector marked in gold. A trade sanctions meeting. A seemingly minor dispute, buried in layers of policy and regulation. To the Council, it was just another routine discussion, one of 1,000 like it. To Voss, it was an opportunity. We make our presence known. He reached for the terminal, fingers hovering over the controls. A single command, and the first seed of disruption would be planted. He smiled, this time with certainty. The Council chamber was a cathedral of control. Every voice within it measured, every gesture precise, every decision a calculated step in the grand choreography of galactic order. Here, nothing was rushed, nothing was uncertain. It was a machine designed to assimilate, to pacify, to ensure that no species, no matter how ambitious, ever disrupted the balance it had cultivated for centuries. And yet, the humans had already done just that. Elias Voss sat with deliberate ease, his posture relaxed but purposeful, his gaze calm, yet unyielding. He had played this game before. On Earth, in conference rooms where wars were decided without a single shot fired. The rules were different here, the players more alien, but the game itself, it remained the same. Beside him, Adrian Hale gave no sign of tension, though Voss knew better. She was watching, analyzing, her fingers resting against the armrest with practiced nonchalance. Across from them, Alan Sato remained unreadable, his sharp eyes fixed on the floating holographic display at the center of the chamber. The Council had not prepared for humanity to move so soon. Ambassador Voss, the High Speaker's voice resonated, a ripple in the otherwise still air. Their elongated frame shimmered under the glow of the central dais, their silvered eyes narrowing slightly. Your presence at this negotiation is an extension of the goodwill granted to your species. You are welcome to observe, to contribute where appropriate, but I caution you to tread carefully. Voss inclined his head slightly, the barest hint of deference. Of course, Speaker, we are honored to take part. His words were correct. His tone was not. A flicker of unease passed through the chamber, barely perceptible but undeniable. For the first time, some of the assembled delegates truly looked at him, at his people, not as a formality, not as an afterthought, but as something new. The negotiation should have been simple. A routine discussion regarding resource distribution in a contested sector. A matter of historical precedent, of numbers and projections. It was not the kind of dispute that altered power structures, unless someone decided to make it one. Voss gestured, and the central projection flickered. The system in question expanded, its trade routes unraveling like a web, glowing strands connecting distant worlds, pulsing with quiet energy. He let the image hang in silence. Let them see it for what it was, not just a territory, but a lifeline. Alan Sato spoke first, his voice soft but deliberate. We've reviewed the proposal. It seems uneven. The Thalvin delegate, a broad-shouldered being plated in shifting iridescence, exhaled a sound between a sigh and a growl. You lack the necessary context, human. The allocations are based on long-standing agreements. Hale smiled, sharp and knowing. History has a way of changing. The shift in the room was subtle, but undeniable. A murmur, a flicker of exchanged glances. The humans were not following the script. Voss leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. We respect precedent, he said, voice smooth. But we also understand efficiency. The current structure consolidates too much power among entrenched interests. A more dynamic approach would benefit the system as a whole. Another movement of his fingers, and the projection shifted, highlighting points of economic disparity. The numbers were unarguable. The implications even more so. The council had spent lifetimes perfecting this game. This balance of control masked as consensus. But in that moment, they saw something new. Humanity was not playing to win favors. They were adjusting the board itself. The Clyde delegate, a sinuous being whose voice carried the rasp of shifting sand, regarded Voss with curiosity. And yet, I do not hear you asking for a greater share for yourselves. Voss's expression barely changed. We are patient. For now. A pause. A long one. And then the room truly shifted. Some of the more astute delegates understood what had just happened. The council had assumed humanity would behave as others had, eager to prove themselves valuable, but cautious not to upset the hierarchy. But the humans had come not to petition, not to plead. They had come to negotiate, to reframe the rules in real time. A murmur of quiet conversation rippled through the chamber. Some delegates subtly repositioned their own arguments, aligning themselves with the proposals the humans had introduced. Others remained silent, reassessing. By the time the negotiations concluded, the agreement had changed. The alterations were small, seemingly insignificant to the uninformed. A shift in resource distribution, an adjustment to oversight protocols. But they were enough. As the chamber emptied, the High Speaker remained seated, their luminous eyes fixed on Voss. Finally they spoke, voice quieter now measured. You do not act as those before you have. Voss met their gaze, unblinking. Then perhaps you should reconsider your expectations. A pause. The speaker studied him a moment longer, then stood, robes flowing around them as they turned and left without another word. Only when the last delegate had departed did Hale exhale, shaking her head. They didn't see it coming. Sato smirked. They will. Voss glanced at the flickering remnants of the holographic display. The first shift had been made, small but irreversible. The foundation had cracked, and cracks had a way of spreading. The stars outside the council station hung motionless, distant pinpricks of cold fire against the black. Within the station's core, the halls pulsed with artificial light, a quiet hum running through the walls, as if the vast structure itself was listening. Elias Voss walked with measured steps, his thoughts weaving through the evening's events. The negotiation had ended, but its ripples were just beginning to spread. He had expected resistance, outright dismissal, perhaps even veiled threats. Instead, the council had listened, not because they respected humanity, but because they had been forced to. That was the first crack in the wall. Beside him, Adrian Hale moved with the effortless confidence of someone who was always prepared for a fight, even in the absence of one. Alan Sato trailed slightly behind, silent as ever, his gaze flicking between the station's security drones as they hovered in the dim corridors. They had been given quarters within the diplomatic sector, a gesture of welcome, of trust, or surveillance. Inside their assigned suite, the lights flickered on automatically, revealing a minimalist space bathed in neutral tones. A panoramic window stretched across one wall, framing the distant glow of a nearby moon. Voss barely acknowledged it. He had no interest in the view. "They're reacting faster than expected," Sato said, lowering himself into one of the angular seats. His fingers drummed against the armrest in slow, deliberate taps. The speaker knew what we were doing. Knowing and stopping are two different things. Hale removed her jacket, tossing it onto the back of a chair before pacing toward the window. Her reflection glared back at her, sharp angles and a calculating gaze. "They underestimated us once. That won't happen again." Voss loosened his collar slightly, his mind already turning over the next step. "That depends on how they process uncertainty. Right now, we're a variable they don't fully understand. The longer we keep them unbalanced, the more influence we gain." Sato exhaled, rubbing his temples. "That only lasts until they decide we're a threat." Voss gave him a sideways glance. "We've been a threat since the moment we walked into that chamber. They just don't realize it yet." A sharp chime interrupted them. The suite's interface activated, the translucent panel on the far wall pulsing with an incoming transmission. Voss exchanged a glance with Hale before stepping forward and accepting the call. The screen flared to life, revealing a figure draped in deep violet robes, their pale, elongated features cast in shadow. High Minister E.L. Sin of the Cly. An unexpected guest. Ambassador Voss. The minister's voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of centuries of political maneuvering. "I trust the evening finds you well." Voss inclined his head. "Minister, to what do we owe the honor?" A.E.L. Sin's violet eyes flickered, unreadable. "You move differently than those who came before you." Voss allowed himself a small smile. "We were never much for tradition." A pause. A.L. Sin studied him, as if peeling back layers, searching for something unspoken. "The council does not yet know what to make of you, but uncertainty breeds opportunity. There are those who would see change, provided it benefits them." Hale crossed her arms, speaking before Voss could. "And you're one of them." A.E.L. Sin did not blink. "I am pragmatic." Voss rested his hands behind his back. "And what does pragmatism require of us?" The minister's expression remained neutral, but something in the stillness of his posture shifted. "You have disrupted the equilibrium. That is dangerous. The Thalvin, the Ilari, even the speaker, they will adapt, but they do not yet trust you. That trust must be earned." Voss tilted his head slightly. "Or circumvented." A.L. Sin did smile then, just a flicker of amusement. "Perhaps." A pause. "There's a transport arriving in 3 cycles, carrying a delegation from the Outer Rim sectors. They bring trade negotiations of significance, ones that could shift allegiances if directed appropriately. I imagine you would find such an event informative." It was not an invitation. It was a test. Voss nodded. "We'll be there." A.L. Sin inclined his head slightly before the transmission cut, the room plunging into silence once more. Sato leaned back in his seat. "That wasn't a conversation. That was a calculation." Hale exhaled sharply. "And we just became part of his equation." Voss looked back at the now dark screen. The minister had given them something valuable, a door slightly ajar. It remained to be seen whether it led to an alliance or a trap. But one thing was certain. The game had changed. The docking bay of the council station was a vast cavern of metal and light, its reinforced walls humming with latent energy. It was designed for function, not beauty, polished, sterile, efficient. The council did not waste resources on embellishment when power was the real currency. Elias Voss stood at the edge of the landing platform, hands clasped behind his back, watching as the delegation transport eased into position. The ship's hull bore no markings beyond a single, unassuming serial code. Neutral, nameless, deliberately unremarkable. But its arrival was anything but ordinary. Behind him, Adrian Hale adjusted the cuff of her jacket, her gaze flicking between the approaching vessel and the security teams stationed along the perimeter. "If this is a trap," she muttered, "it's an elaborate one." Alan Sato, ever the strategist, barely glanced up from his datapad. "It's not a trap," he murmured, scrolling through the latest intelligence reports. "It's an assessment." AEL Sin wants to see what we do with an opportunity. Voss allowed himself a faint smile. Then let's make an impression. The ship touched down with mechanical precision, its landing gear hissing as it met the platform. A moment later, the main hatch unsealed, releasing a thin vapor of pressurized air. The figures that emerged were draped in the flowing silks of the outer rim delegations, their garments shifting between iridescent hues as they moved. Their leader, a woman with metallic filaments woven into her skin, strode forward with the assurance of someone who understood her own significance. She stopped before Voss, tilting her head slightly. "Elias Voss," she said, her voice smooth but edged with curiosity. The humans move quickly. Voss met her gaze without hesitation. The galaxy doesn't wait for those who hesitate. A small smile played at the corner of her lips. Perhaps not. Her name was Lyrian Vass, a representative of the Ascari, a species known for their commerce, their ability to shift allegiances with the ease of changing seasons. They were not warriors. They were something far more dangerous. Voss gestured toward the corridor leading to the council's private negotiation chambers. "Shall we?" Lyrian studied him a moment longer, then nodded. The delegation followed, their movements fluid, practiced. As they entered the chamber, the high speaker was already seated, their luminous eyes tracking every movement with quiet intensity. Other council members flanked them, their expressions neutral, but their presence deliberate. This meeting had been arranged quickly, but not without preparation. Voss took his seat with careful ease, flanked by Hale and Sato. Across from them, Lyrian folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. The speaker's voice was calm, but laced with quiet authority. The Ascari bring forth proposals of trade expansion. This affects many within the council. Humanity has requested to observe. A pause, deliberate. Perhaps contribute. The implication was clear. Voss had maneuvered his way into this room, but he was still an outsider. Lyrian turned her attention fully to him. "I imagine you did not request a seat here, simply to listen." Voss smiled. "Listening is valuable, but so is opportunity." He activated the chamber's central display, bringing up a holographic map of council-controlled trade routes. A seemingly harmless visualization, a set of glowing lines stretching across star systems. But the meaning was clear to those who understood the true nature of power. "The current routes favor established interests," Voss said smoothly. "They are predictable, secure." He tilted his head slightly. "But predictability is not always a strength." Lyrian's gaze flickered, interest sharpening. Hale leaned forward, her voice casual. "A static network is easy to disrupt. The more centralized the control, the more vulnerable it becomes." One of the Thalvin delegates, the same one who had scoffed at them in the previous negotiation, exhaled sharply. "What exactly are you proposing, human?" Voss tapped the display. The hologram shifted, revealing alternate trade routes, pathways that bypassed existing bottlenecks. They were unconventional, less efficient in the traditional sense, but they created flexibility, resilience. "We're proposing adaptability," he said simply, "the ability to adjust, to shift before instability becomes collapse." The room was silent for a fraction too long. Then Lyrian chuckled softly. "You speak like a merchant, but you think like a strategist." Voss inclined his head. "Aren't they the same thing?" Another pause. The high speaker's fingers tapped against the armrest, an unreadable rhythm. "You seek influence." Voss met their gaze. "I seek stability, a beat, which requires change." The council members exchanged glances, the unspoken conversation passing through the room like a current. The humans were not simply adapting. They were altering the landscape. Lyrian leaned back in her chair, amusement in her eyes. "I think we will have much to discuss." The session continued, but the balance had already shifted. As the meeting adjourned, the delegates departed in measured strides, their expressions thoughtful. Hale exhaled, watching them go. "That could have gone worse." Sato glanced at Voss. "They didn't dismiss us." Voss studied the empty chamber, his thoughts already a step ahead. "No," he murmured. They didn't, and that was the first victory. The council chamber was no longer a place of quiet certainty. The air, once thick with the weight of tradition, now carried the tension of something unspoken, something inevitable. Where once the human delegation had been met with polite indifference, now they were watched with wary calculation. The game had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. Elias Voss stepped into the chamber with the same measured confidence as before, but the difference was palpable. He was no longer an outsider knocking at the door. He was a presence that could not be ignored. Adrian Hale moved beside him, eyes sharp, posture easy but alert. Alan Sato trailed slightly behind, his silence never passive, his mind working through angles that even the council had yet to see. The High Speaker sat at the head of the chamber, their expression as unreadable as ever, but there was something different in their stillness. Not quite apprehension, not yet respect, but awareness. That, in itself, was a victory. The gathered delegates, their forms varied in height, texture, and breadth, turned toward them. Some leaned forward intent. Others remained rigid, unwilling to show interest but unable to dismiss it entirely. Among them, Lyrian Vass of the Ascari sat poised, a glimmer of amusement in her gaze. She knew, just as Voss did, that today's meeting would decide far more than the official agenda suggested. The speaker's voice, a perfect balance of authority and neutrality, filled the space. The final deliberations on trade reallocation will proceed. All parties may present their concluding statements. A pause, calculated, including our newest members. There it was. Recognition. Voss inclined his head slightly, accepting the invitation for what it was. Not generosity, but acknowledgement of leverage. The Thalvin delegate spoke first, their deep, resonant voice layered with irritation. This assembly has long functioned on stability, on precedent. Our structures exist for a reason. These adjustments, the word was spat rather than spoken, threatened to unsettle what has been carefully maintained. Hale smiled, a blade hidden behind courtesy. Change is only a threat to those who refuse to adapt. A murmur rippled through the chamber, subtle but undeniable. The tension had teeth now. Voss leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, deliberate. A structure that cannot withstand change is not stability. It is stagnation. He gestured toward the holographic display, where the newly proposed trade routes shimmered in strands of pale gold and deep blue. This system has endured because it has been flexible when necessary. This is one of those moments. The Clyde delegate, always watchful, tilted their head. You claim to seek balance, yet your species moves like one accustomed to disruption. Voss allowed himself a small smile. Adaptation is not disruption. It is survival. Lyrian Vass gave the barest nod, her gaze flicking to the speaker. The game was nearly at its end, and everyone in the room was beginning to see the pieces for what they were. The speaker studied the display for a long moment before finally speaking. The council exists to ensure the prosperity of its members. If prosperity requires adjustment, then adjustment will be made. The decision, wrapped in its careful neutrality, was handed down. The motion passed. The old allocations, so fiercely protected for decades, had been rewritten. Not dramatically, not enough to cause upheaval, but enough. Enough for humanity to have its foothold. Enough for the first irreversible shift in power. As the session concluded, the delegates began to rise, their movements slower than before, their thoughts still catching up to what had just occurred. Some would resist, some would adapt, but none could deny what had taken place. The humans had entered the chamber as observers. They left as players. Outside, as the doors sealed behind them, Hale exhaled sharply, shaking her head with something between amusement and disbelief. Didn't think they'd actually do it. Sato adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. They didn't do it for us. They did it because they had no choice. Voss remained silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping the station's vast corridors, the quiet hum of unseen machinery vibrating beneath their feet. This is just the beginning. His voice was quiet, but the certainty in it was absolute. Hale smirked. Good. I was getting bored. They walked on, deeper into the heart of the station, into the unknown future they had just rewritten. The Council had sought to shape humanity. Instead, humanity had begun to shape the Council.